Walter White kept his secret as a meth cook for nearly 2 years. However, over the course of the show's 5 seasons, almost 65 people uncovered his double life as Heisenberg, the notorious drug lord. From Walter's daughter to Hank on the toilet. In this video, we're going to cover every single person who knew Walter White's secret. The first person to know Walter White was a drug dealer was of course Jesse Pinkman, as without him, what would have never started. What started as a desperate partnership soon spiraled into a nightmare for Jesse, shaping the course of his life in ways he could have never anticipated. After Walt learned that Jesse had been involved in a recent meth lab bust, he tracked him down, seeing an opportunity to exploit Jesse's connections in the drug trade. Jesse, a small-time dealer accustomed to skirting by on charm and reckless ambition, found himself cornered when Walt forced him into an arrangement. With Walt's chemistry expertise and Jesse's distribution network, the two formed an uneasy alliance. But Jesse had little idea of the dangerous road ahead. At first, Jesse resisted, unwilling to trust a former high school teacher who suddenly wanted in on the business. But Walt's manipulation was insidious, persuading him by threatening to turn him in.
But you know the business, and I know the chemistry.
With that, the partnership was sealed, binding Jesse to Walt in a way that would cost him more than he'd ever imagined. In the immediate aftermath, Jesse had no clue what he had just set in motion. What started as a way to make money quickly turned into something far darker, as Walt's influence grew and his willingness to manipulate Jesse deepened. Jesse, still naive to the full extent of Walt's ambition, followed his lead, unaware that he had stepped into a world where morality was irrelevant and survival was uncertain. This moment marked the beginning of Jesse's suffering, and you'll see that in a little bit as this video plays out. The next person to discover Walt's secret was Domingo Molina, better known as Crazy 8, a small-time drug dealer in Albuquerque who was also a DEA informant. Using law enforcement to eliminate his rival, Crazy 8 thought he was playing the game smart. But in the end, his double life led him straight into the path of Walter White. When Walt entered the drug trade, Jesse Pinkman introduced him to Crazy 8 as a potential distributor, but things quickly turned sour. Crazy 8 and his cousin Emilio suspected Jesse of snitching, unaware that it was actually Crazy 8 who had tipped off the DEA, leading to Emilio's arrest. Seeking revenge, they kidnapped Jesse and forced him to lead them to Walt.
Listen to me, I'll teach you my recipe. Huh? What do you say, you want to cook like me?
Cornered in the RV, Walt pretended to negotiate, but instead released toxic phosphine gas, killing Emilio instantly while Crazy 8 barely survived. Walt and Jesse chained him in Jesse's basement, unsure what to do next. At first, Walt bonded with Crazy 8 and considered letting him go, until he realized Crazy 8 had hidden a broken plate ready to strike. Left with no choice, Walt strangled him. The first kill haunted him, but it also marked his transformation into Heisenberg. Meanwhile, the DEA, led by Hank Schrader, began investigating Crazy 8's disappearance, unknowingly taking the first steps towards uncovering Walt's empire. About 5 people found out next, including Tuco and his henchmen. After Crazy 8's death, Walter and Jesse needed a new distributor. That's when Tuco Salamanca, a violent cartel enforcer, discovered them, pulling them deeper into the criminal underworld. Jesse's contact, Skinny Pete, boasted about knowing Tuco from prison and arranged a meeting. Confident but naive, Jesse pitched their meth, expecting a fair deal. Instead, Tuco beat him senseless and stole the product, setting the tone for their partnership. With Jesse hospitalized, Walt took matters into his own hands. Adopting his new alias, Heisenberg, he stormed into Tuco's hideout and demanded $50,000 payment for the meth and Jesse's injuries. When Tuco laughed, Walt threw a crystal of fulminated mercury to the floor, causing a violent explosion. Holding the rest as leverage, he forced Tuco to pay up.
You got balls. I'll give you that.
Impressed by Walt's nerve, Tuco not only agreed, but proposed a partnership. Walt seized the moment, pushing him to buy 2 pounds of meth instead of 1. Tuco accepted, launching a dangerous alliance. In the long term, working with Tuco proved disastrous, leading to the next person who discovered Walt's secret, Hector Salamanca. After the DEA cracked down on Tuco Salamanca's operation, he kidnapped Walter White and Jesse Pinkman, dragging them to his uncle Hector's remote cottage. Though Hector appeared senile and obsessed with TV, he remained sharp and dangerously loyal to the cartel. When Walt tried to poison Tuco's burrito, Hector rang his bell furiously, exposing the deception. Tuco, now suspicious, forced Jesse outside and beat him until Walt confessed. But before Tuco could retaliate, Hank Schrader arrived. A gunfight erupted, ending with Hank killing Tuco, unknowingly eliminating his biggest threat yet. Walt and Jesse escaped, but Hector remembered everything. He had seen their faces, heard their names, and knew exactly who they were. Drug dealers. Years later, despite his loyalty to the cartel, Hector ended up teaming up with Walter, but we'll get onto that later. Now if you're enjoying the video at this point, then make sure to subscribe. After Tuco Salamanca's death, Walt and Jesse decided that they couldn't risk working with another unhinged criminal. Instead, they took matters into their own hands, built a distribution network with Jesse's friends, Badger, Skinny Pete, and Combo as their dealers. Jesse was supposed to handle a pickup, but after a traumatic encounter left him shaken, he was in no state to do so. Walt stepped in, taking over the pickup himself. For the first time, Badger, Skinny Pete, and Combo met the infamous Heisenberg.
I'm Heisenberg.
He looked just as they had imagined, calculating, ruthless, and even more terrifying in person than the stories they had heard. With his presence alone, he commanded respect, making it clear who was in charge. The next person to find out was arguably the most important in this entire video. Saul Goodman was the next person to discover Walter White was a drug lord. When Badger got caught in a DEA sting, Walt and Jesse urgently needed a lawyer. Jesse suggested Saul Goodman, the flashy, morally flexible attorney behind Albuquerque's infamous Better Call Saul ads.
$10,000.
Walt, posing as Badger's uncle, tried to bribe Saul with $10,000 to make the problem disappear, but Saul didn't take the bait, so they kidnapped him instead. Dumped in the desert with a gun to his head, Saul assumed that it was a cartel hit, begged for his life, and blamed someone named Lalo. But when he heard Walter coughing, he realized who it was. Realizing his captors were clueless, he quickly shifted gears and talked his way out. This was the moment Saul realized that this seemingly random old man was actually an ambitious drug dealer aiming for the top. From that point on, Saul was trapped. What started as simple legal work quickly escalated into money laundering, cover-ups, and even murder. But that's a video for another day. Comment down if you want to see that. Looking back, getting involved with Walter White was probably the worst decision of his life. Mike and then Gus were the next people to find out. Mike Ehrmantraut was the first to see the warning signs. Working as Gus Fring's enforcer, Mike did his homework when Saul Goodman introduced Walter White, a high school teacher turned meth cook with terminal lung cancer. Mike warned Saul to stay away. Walt was reckless, amateurish, and a walking disaster waiting to happen. But his 99.1% pure meth was too valuable to ignore. Against his instincts, Gus agreed to a 3-month contract with Walt. Mike ran a background check, confirming Walt's connection to the DEA through Hank Schrader, and flagged him as a long-term liability. And honestly, Gus should have listened, because Walt's ambition quickly spiraled out of control. Walt manipulated Jesse, murdering Gail, and started a war with Gus. Mike tried to keep the peace, but Walt struck first, using Hector Salamanca to kill Gus in a suicide bombing. Mike should have walked away. Instead, he joined Walt, his final mistake. When he refused to give up Gus's men, Walt shot him in cold blood. In the end, Walt destroyed them both, the two most disciplined men in the game, outplayed by a dying chemistry teacher with nothing to lose. Huell and Kubi, as Saul's closest enforcers, discovered Walt's secret identity alongside him. But unlike Saul, their long-term fates took very different turns. When Walt was arrested, then escaped and vanished, Huell was picked up by the DEA just like Saul. But unlike his boss, Huell was a small fish, scared, clueless, and ultimately let go. Kubi, on the other hand, had a different plan. When Saul sent them to load Walt's money from the storage unit to barrels, Kubi saw an opportunity. Skimming a few bands off the top seemed insignificant against Walt's fortune. He was wrong, but Walt didn't care. Maybe because he had bigger problems.
Figure you want to check to make sure it's still all there?
You figured right.
Close enough.
Between his cut from Saul's job, the train heist payday, and what he pocketed from Walt, Kubi had enough to disappear. And that's exactly what he did. No last job, no loyalty, just an exit strategy. The last anyone heard of him, he was living it up far from New Mexico. Unlike Saul and Huell, Kubi never looked back. The same can be said for Saul's receptionist. The day after Saul was taken, Francesca finally learned who Walt really was. As Saul's receptionist, she has always been in the loop, handling Ice Station Zebra Associates and every other shell company he had set up. She saw it all, but by the time the authorities came knocking, there was nothing left for her to do but watch everything unravel. Low as she was, it didn't matter. With all of Saul's assets seized and the empire in ruins, Francesca was left managing a 3-story apartment building, constantly under watch in case she led the feds to him. She was even forced to give up nearly $1 million from one of his overseas accounts. Still, she did what she could, shredding documents, covering tracks, keeping quiet. Even after Walt was caught and Saul was gone, she stayed loyal, waiting for that one last call. On November 12th, she picked up the payphone at a rundown gas station, collected what little money Saul had left for her, and gave him the bad news. Everything was gone. Saul said goodbye. Francesca hung up without a word. It was over. The next person who found out was Jane. Jane was Jesse's first and only true love. They fell fast, bound by rebellion and addiction, but her grip on him was stronger than anyone realized. When Jesse told her about who Walt was and the money he owed him, Jane had her own idea. With Jesse too strung out to fight, Jane stepped in, forcing Walt's hand. She tried to blackmail him into handing over more than $500,000, but her victory was short-lived. Her addiction consumed her, and when she overdosed, Walt stood by and let it happen. He could have saved her, but he didn't. It was better for Jesse, better for him. Jane's death shattered Jesse and sent her father into a spiral that ended in a catastrophe. Planes fell from the sky, lives were lost, and Jesse never truly recovered. Without Jane, Walt had one less obstacle in his way. No more interference, no more threats, he had Jesse all to himself. Holly may not have seemed like an obvious addition to the list, especially this early, but her connection to Walt's empire was established from the moment she was born. As Skyler's unexpected pregnancy unfolded, Holly became a symbol of Walt's transformation. From the baby shower video to her mother's desperate attempts to protect her, Holly was always at the center of the family's shifting dynamics. But the moment that truly defined her role came days just after her birth. Late at night, Walt cradled his newborn daughter in the garage, whispering to her as he peeled back the insulation in the wall. Behind it, stacks of cash, his hard-earned fortune from the drug trade.
See what your daddy did for you.
She wouldn't remember, but in that moment, Holly was given a glimpse of everything Walt had built, without seeing the destruction that came with it. For her, it was just a pile of money, not the empire that had torn her family apart. After countless lies, fabricated stories, and hidden secrets, Skyler finally discovered the truth about Walt in Season 3. This had been building for a long time, and by now, Walt had already moved out, but in that time, she pieced it together. He wasn't just hiding something, he was a drug dealer. She didn't suspect, she knew.
You're a drug dealer.
There was no way out of it. No more excuses, no more deceptions. There was nothing left for Walt to manipulate, no more doubts for him to exploit. So he admitted it. Not just a dealer, a manufacturer, a cook. At first, Skyler wanted to throw up, to run, to turn him in. She told her divorce attorney everything, weighing the risk. She had every reason to go to the police, every reason to destroy him. But Walt didn't crumble. He didn't fold to her demands. He refused to let the kids stay at Hank and Mary's. He refused to give her the easy way out. And so Skyler broke. The money, the security, the leverage, it all mattered more than justice. More than revenge. She stayed, especially now with Hank's medical bills mounting, with Walt's empire bleeding into their lives. She chose to keep Walt's secret. Now, I don't understand all the hate that Skyler got. I mean, she did what any normal person would do if they found out that their husband was one of the biggest drug lords in the country. But that's just me. When Skyler first realized the truth about Walt, she turned to Pamela Orbick, a family lawyer in Albuquerque, for guidance. At first, it was about a divorce. Her husband had become a different man, one she no longer recognized. But as she confided in Pamela, the truth spelled out. Walt was manufacturing meth. Pamela wasted no time outlining Skyler's options. She could file for a divorce immediately. More importantly, she could just go to the police, protect herself and her children, and put an end to Walt's crimes. Legally, Skyler was protected. Attorney-client privilege meant Pamela couldn't report anything. The decision was hers alone, but she hesitated. Turning in Walt meant destroying everything. the father of her children, her 20-year marriage, and Hank's entire career. The weight of those consequences kept her frozen. Pamela urged her to act, but Skyler couldn't do it. She walked away, leaving her lawyer with no options. Emotion had won over logic. From that moment on, she was in too deep. The chance to escape was gone, and she would have to live with the choice that she made. Gil had known about Walt's meth long before they met, but the meth was all that he knew. Gil had no idea who the ruthless man behind it all was. But when Gus decided to have the two work together, Gil finally discovered the man behind the meth. Working as his lab assistant, Gil looked up to Walt greatly, and they seemed to work together with insane fluidity, until they started to get closer and the issues started cropping up. Most of all, Walt valued Jesse and wanted him over Gil, and when it came to Gil becoming Walt's replacement, Heisenberg showed no mercy in his heart for a fellow chemist, having Jesse kill Gil. This just proves that nobody can walk away clean from this business. Nobody. Gus ensured his employees understood exactly who they were dealing with when they brought in Walt. At first, they knew little, just enough to keep things running. But as the stakes grew, so did their knowledge of Walt, enough to keep him in check. Except Victor flew too close to the sun. From delivering Gus's non-negotiable terms to Walt to overseeing his operations, he learned more than he should have. He watched, listened, and eventually decided that he could do more than enforce. He could replace. He tried to mimic Walt's formula to prove his worth, and Gus made an example of him, slicing his throat in cold blood. And Tyrus would follow, stepping into Victor's shoes as Gus's silent enforcer, ever watchful, ever loyal. He kept Jesse and Walt in line, enforcing Gus's orders, but when Walt used Hector Salamanca as a weapon, not even Tyrus's vigilance could stop what came next. For me personally, this was one of the best episodes in the show, but I want to hear what you guys think, so comment down what was your favorite moment. The next people to discover who Walt was were Todd and the Vominos pest crew. There were about 10 there than Todd, but they knew very little about what was up to, only that it was illegal and involved drugs. Their job was simple: set up the houses, keep their heads down, and never ask questions. But Todd had ambitions. He wanted to prove himself, and the train heist was his chance. He executed Walt's plan flawlessly, until a boy saw them. Todd shot him without hesitation. That was the moment Jesse saw Todd for what he really was. After Jesse left, Todd took his place as Walt's new assistant, eager to learn, eager to please, and when Walt walked away, Todd kept cooking under the protection of his Uncle Jack's game. But Walt came back, and this time, he wasn't playing games. With one final trick, Walt wiped out the entire gang, everyone except Jack and Todd. And Jesse, he got what he'd been waiting for. Todd tried to look outside, try to see what had happened, but before he could, Jesse wrapped the chains around his throat and squeezed. Walt had let Jesse decide Todd's fate, and Jesse made sure he never took another breath. This brings me nicely on to the next people. Lydia was one of Gus Fring's most trusted associates, using her position at Magical Electromotive to smuggle methylamine and phenylacetic acid for his empire. After Gus's death, she found herself in panic mode, fearing that Gus's former men, especially Mike Ehrmantraut, would expose her to the DEA. She attempted to have Mike killed, but the plan backfired. Instead, Mike cornered her in her own home, ready to execute her for her betrayal. Desperate to survive, Lydia bargained for her life by offering an ocean of methylamine from an upcoming train shipment. Seeing the opportunity, Walt, Jesse, and Mike spared her, leading to one of their most daring operations, the train heist. As Walt's empire grew, Lydia saw international potential, expanding the meth trade into the Czech Republic. But when Walt retired, she partnered with Todd Alquist and his neo-Nazi gang, keeping Jesse Pinkman as a slave cook to continue production. When Walt returned for revenge, he laced Lydia's stevia with ricin, ensuring a slow, painful death. As she lay dying, she realized Heisenberg had beaten her too, just like Gus, Mike, and everyone else who had crossed his path. Uncle Jack and his gang of 10 knew Walt was dangerous the moment Todd introduced them. Unlike his nephew, Jack saw the ruthless, cold, and calculating man behind the genius. Walt's first request? 10 prison hits, coordinated across 3 facilities in under 2 minutes. Jack hesitated. Pulling that off was nearly impossible, but Walt didn't care. He wasn't looking for a discussion. He was looking for results.
It can be done exactly how I want it.
And Jack delivered. 9 shanked and 1 burned alive. No loose ends. Jack respected Walt after that. When the standoff with Hank happened, Jack repaid that respect, leaving Walt a barrel of $10 million after executing his brother-in-law. But what Jack mistook for mutual respect was just temporary necessity. Walt never forgot, never forgave. In the end, Jack underestimated him. Walt walked into Jack's compound under the pretense of a deal. But when Jack, smug and self-assured, dragged out Jesse to prove a point, he gave Walt the opening he needed. A single press of a button. And in seconds, Jack's empire was shredded by a hail of bullets. Mortally wounded, Jack lit a cigarette, still trying to bargain, to buy time. But this time, Walt didn't hesitate. No deals, no discussions. He pulled the trigger, watching as Jack slumped, lifeless. Walt left, no loose ends. There were whispers in the criminal underworld about a man trying to step into Heisenberg's shoes. Declan had built his own empire with about 10 others, running a meth operation with a product that, while profitable, was nothing compared to the legends. Declan was a businessman, always looking for an opportunity, and when Heisenberg came knocking, that opportunity presented itself. Mike Ehrmantraut was the first connection, a business contact from the Gus Fring era. Declan knew how to make deals, how to stay off the radar, but when he, Jesse Pinkman, and Mike met in the desert, things didn't go as planned. He wanted control. He wanted all of the stolen methylamine, but Heisenberg had other plans. Days later, Walter White arranged a meeting, not just to buy product, but to assert control. Heisenberg made it clear, Declan would distribute his 99.1% pure meth, no negotiations.
Say my name.
You what? I don't have a damn clue who the hell you are.
Yeah, you do. I'm the cook. I'm the man who killed Gus Fring.
Bullshit. Cartel got Fring.
You sure? That's right. Now, say my name.
Heisenberg.
Declan hesitated. He understood what was happening. For a while, it worked. Heisenberg ran the empire, and Declan moved the product. The money poured in. But then, Heisenberg walked away. Declan took over. He promoted Todd Alquist to cook, trying to keep the operation alive. But when Todd failed to meet the standard, Declan fired him and went back to his old ways. That was his mistake. Lydia Quayle wanted pure meth for the Czech market. She needed Heisenberg-level quality. Declan refused. If Heisenberg was gone, so was his product. So she called Jack Welker. A massacre. Jack and his neo-Nazi gang wiped out Declan's crew in the Arizona desert. Declan tried to crawl away, a desperate move for a man who once shook hands with Heisenberg. Jack put a bullet in his head. Declan thought that he was making a business decision. Instead, he signed his own death warrant. Heisenberg didn't just cook men, he built an empire. And Declan, he was just another name on the long list of men who thought that they could replace him. They all ended up in the same way, dead. Hank, Maury, Walt Jr., and Steve Gomez each learned the truth at different times, but Walter's world truly unraveled over what should have been an ordinary lunch. What began as a casual gathering turned into a moment of shocking clarity when he discovered Gail's book, a gift from Walt. Suddenly, the missing piece in his investigation snapped into place. Realizing the implications, Hank confided in Marie before launching a solo investigation into Walt's secret life. His opportunity arrived when Jesse, pushed to his limit, decided to turn against Walt. With Jesse's help, Hank carefully devised a plan to bring Walt down, using intellect and strategy to stay ahead. For a brief moment, it seemed like they had won, but Walt had already set wheels in motion. Jack and his gang arrived at the worst possible moment, turning what should have been Walt's downfall into Hank's demise. At the car wash, Marie triumphantly told Skyler, Walt Jr., and the entire family that Hank had finally arrested Walt. But the moment of relief turned to horror when Walt called, revealing the truth. Hank was dead. Marie and Walt Jr. were shattered, the news sinking in as the reality of Walt's actions became undeniable. Soon after, Hank and Steve Gomez's bodies were found, marking the tragic end of Hank's pursuit of justice. I don't really have to say how sad the scene was. When Walter White's empire crumbled, capture was not an option. He needed to escape. Hank Schrader was dead. His family had turned against him. The DEA was closing in. There was no one left to turn to. No one except Ed. Ed ran a vacuum repair shop as a cover, but in reality, He was the man criminals called when they needed to disappear. Saul Goodman had mentioned him once, a last resort option. Walt ignored it then, convinced he could outthink his enemies. But now, there were no more moves left to play. So with what little he had left, Walt paid the price. Ed drove him across the country, hidden in a propane truck, to a cold, isolated cabin in New Hampshire. This was his new life, a life of exile. For months, Ed was Walt's only link to the outside world. He brought him supplies, handled his chemotherapy, and when the loneliness became unbearable, even stayed for a game of cards. Walt offered him thousands just to sit and talk, before Walt left to deal with his unfinished business. The only man to work with Walter White and walk away clean. After fighting his wife and son, quite literally, Walt Jr. called the police, claiming his father attacked his mother. Walt took Holly and ran, leaving Skyler and Walt Jr. in shambles back at the house. Skyler had no choice but to give everything up. It made international news. Everyone knew who the great Heisenberg was and what he had done. All of his crimes were publicized, and there wasn't a soul who didn't know what he'd done. And that's everyone who knew Walter White's secret. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video where we talk about every single person Walter White killed.